In this class, I would like to talk about menus, specifically the menu button. Many websites, in addition to possibly having a horizontal main navigation, also have a menu button. When I click on this button, the menu pops down. When I click again, the menu pops up. How you design the menu is up to you. What I would like to do is to explain to you how this button works. We also see the same effect on GoDaddy. However, they are using this very recognizable three-line menu, also referred to as a hamburger menu. When I click, we have a side menu, and we can close it and go back. Another example is this clothing manufacturer. Notice there is no navigation at all. However, up here in the left, we have again our three-line menu. People are beginning to recognize that this is an icon for a menu, and when I click, I will see a menu, and then I will have an option to close that menu. Typically, whenever you click on a web page, that click is handled by JavaScript. I will explain how you can do that. I will also explain another trick in which we can use HTML and CSS. I would like to begin by discussing the various ways that these menu buttons can be developed, and all of the code in this presentation is available for you in a zip file. You can use an image, and an SVG image would actually work well. Again, these are referred to as a three-line menu or a hamburger menu. Generally, how we create them is by using CSS. So essentially, we have some kind of an element, and it may be an empty element. And what we do with CSS is we will style the top and bottom borders. So there could be one or two elements involved. We also use a button with actually three elements. And rather than using borders, we put a background color in those elements. And that seems to be more consistent and looks nicer than the other options. Again, the clicking typically involves JavaScript, but we will see how we can do this with pure HTML. So in my first demo, I am using the button element. The reason I'm using that is because it's accessible to screen readers and they will know to click on that. Inside we have an empty span with a class of hamburger. So what we're doing is we're coding a top and bottom border, and then we're actually adding some fake content and putting another border on that and coloring those borders and giving them a thickness, and that actually makes up the menu icon. And I have the word menu sitting next to it also. We also could just use a hexadecimal value inside our button element. However, you would need to change the default styles of the button so that you don't have the border or a color on it. And it would give you this icon. When we create with CSS, it's usually more efficient than using an image. Another way would be using Font Awesome. So again, we would use the button element, and inside we have our I, and because there's no content in here, we should hide this from the screen readers. So this would be using a Font Awesome icon. Another trick is using the button element, and rather than an extra span to be styled, we're actually styling the button itself. And what we're doing is we're giving it a top border that is double and a bottom border that is solid using the before pseudo element. The last example that I have, and this is the most common, again, we're using the button element and we have three spans. Because each span has nothing in them, we need to hide them from the screen readers using our area properties. And we are using a background color. Of course, we set a height and width for each span. We have a background color, which is making up each of the three lines. This is the most common, and this is the button that I will be using in all of my click demos. So let's take an example of a menu using JavaScript, and this menu uses positioning. Whenever you have a menu, it generally should overlap the content. Most of my menu examples do not use positioning in order to simplify the code. So here we have our button, and inside the button we have a span for the menu and another span that is empty. So we have the word menu, and now we have the 3 lines over here. And this is done using CSS, which is not shown here, but it is shown in the file. This is our menu. Notice we're using the nav element according to HTML5 standards. We're using the UL and the LIs for the links according to HTML5 standards. When the page loads, this is hidden. We don't see it. So when we click, we show it. What we're doing is we're manipulating this class. We're actually removing it and then adding it back again. So the JavaScript is relatively simple. What we're doing, we're accessing the menu ID equals menu, which is right here, and that's our nav. And then we have the ID of menu button, and that's what we're clicking right here. So here, when we click on the menu button, we're going to call this function, and all the function is actually doing is using the class list property to toggle the hide class, meaning the first time we click, we remove it, the second time we click, we put it back. So we're toggling the hide class on and off. We're leaving it there, removing it, putting it back, removing it, putting it back, removing it, and that manipulates the menu. So here's our menu button, and when I click, notice it will overlap the content because we have positioning, and when I click again, it hides it. So we have this toggle, we're toggling the hide class, it's like an on-off switch. And that's essentially what we're doing. Relatively simple concept. I have another example that uses the same JavaScript, but we're also adding some CSS animation, and you can find more information about it here, also in the file that I have. I do not have the HTML because it's the same HTML as we had on the previous slide. However, what we have on our 3 spans, which make up the 3 lines of the menu, we're using the transform property, and we're rotating the first one, we're rotating the second one, and we're essentially hiding the middle one by changing the opacity. So what we're doing in our JavaScript function, in addition to toggling the class hide, we're also going to toggle a class on this menu, meaning we're going to add this class of change on and off. So we don't have the class of change added the first time, so that when we click, this will be added to all of these 3. And the effect will happen. The effect is we change these 3 lines into the X. So that's how they do this. That's why you generally use the 3-line menu using the 3 spans, because you need to transform those lines into these degrees in order to get the X when you click. So now when I click, the 3 lines change to the X, and when I click, they change back. You can see that middle one slowly leaving due to the opacity change. Now notice I am not using positioning here, so that the menu just shows itself and it pushes the rest of the content down. Again, positioning should be used, but I have omitted it in most examples to make the code more simple. I would finally like to show you a very nice trick how you can use an HTML checkbox and no JavaScript to accomplish this interaction. Again, I have several files for you, and we have a demo on CodePen. When we click the icon, the menu will display. The 3 lines will change to the X, and when we click that, it will hide again. So if you look at the HTML, we have an input type equals checkbox. However, we don't see this. Then we have a label. The label element is enclosing both the word menu and these 3 lines. So all of this is the label. In HTML, if you click on a label, you will automatically check the checkbox. So what I have done, I have actually uncommented some of the CSS so that you can actually see. This is what we're doing. We're actually putting a checkbox here. This is all the label. When I click, it checks. When I click again, it unchecks. So we can click on a label to toggle checkboxes on and off. This will also apply to a radio, but you generally use checkboxes. All right, so how does that help us? Let's look at the CSS. I'm going to direct your attention to this last line of code. Remember that the menu down here is hidden. We have a class equals hide, meaning the display is set to none. And what we're doing is we're changing the display to block. And we're doing that with the CSS. And take a look at this long selector. It's relatively complicated. All right, input type equals checkbox. That's an attribute selector, :checked. It means that when this is checked, now what's the next part of the selector? And we have an adjacent sibling, which is a label, which we do. And we have an adjacent sibling #menu, which we do. What are we going to do with this selector? So this long selector is pointing to #menu, but it only points to #menu under the context of it being an adjacent sibling to label and an adjacent sibling to the checkbox being checked, which is what we have going on here. When we click on the menu, the checkbox will be checked. And what do? We set the display to block, meaning we see the menu. This CSS is just changing the direction of these lines again, which we have already seen. So again, our class of hide for the menu is set to display none, and we set that to display block when this checkbox is checked, and we have an adjacent label and the adjacent ID, which is right here. So this is actually a very nice, very cool way of clicking without JavaScript. I have my example again. This is technically the label. I click, the menu appears. I click, the menu goes away. So again, we're seeing this more and more on web pages. Rather than have any navigation, we just have our menu buttons. We also see it a lot in mobile responsive layout. So if I were to change the page, here we now have our 3-line menu. However, this is done within a media query. So we're changing our navigation within the media query. However, we're still using the same concept. I have tried to point out how we create these buttons and some of the principles behind how they're used. So it's up to you to decide how you implement it into your website and into your responsive layouts.